whatever you want to call it, off center, offset, multi-axis turning. There are multiple styles, whether you're spindle turning or face turning. But with that, of course, go multiple techniques. And if you want to purchase any of the accessories, there are lots of people that will sell you all sorts of jigs, chuck attachments, all sorts of things that you can buy. But what I'm going to describe here is just one method, and it's a method that I don't turn multi-axis a lot, but every now and then I want to do it. So this is the simplest way I found to turn multi-axis. So in terms of selecting the blank, I'll come back to this later as well. But one of the things you need to think about is the swing of your lathe and the offset. So on a blank, I'm going to use a worm screw in the chuck. So I drill a hole in the center, and then you drill a second hole. You pick your distance, but just be prepared, because if you go 10 mil away, you've got a 20 mil swing at its widest point. So the further you go away, the more off balance you are. So I was about 15 mil away in this particular instance. I selected that second hole, the hole on the left, if you like, based on figure in the piece. There was spalting to the right, which I wanted to highlight an accent, and a little bit of it wasn't a defect, but it was just a piece that I wanted to cut out. So that effectively becomes the bowl. So I was looking at this piece and looking at grain orientation as well, as I sort of selected where that second hole was going to go. While I'm using a worm screw here, you can use a faceplate. If you wanted to use a faceplate in there, you would still mark the holes in the same way and then line the faceplate up, or you'd mark the center and your offset, but you'd then have to line the faceplate up as best you can. You've got to be careful though when you use a faceplate, because you want significant depth in the blank to be able to account for those screw holes. I know Mike Walt actually has a YouTube video up where he did an off-center piece, and he ended up filling the screw holes from his faceplate, because the piece just wasn't beefy enough to account for the screws. So just something to sort of bear in mind as you go through. Once you got the blank done, as I said, I'm using a worm screw. Some people recommend waxing the worm screw so that you can actually pull the piece off, because this was a green turning. So, that's just, personal choice. The one thing that I will recommend, go with the larger the jaws you can for the worm screw, because it provides a much larger surface area for the blank to seat against once you wind it into the worm screw. I've seen a number of people do this, and they use sort of 50 mil jaws. You can do it, but you're not getting, I mean, these are 100 mil jaws. So you're not getting the surface area to seat the blank up, and getting things true is the art of the game here. So larger the jaws, the better stability you're going to get, and the better accuracy you get as you face off the piece. So what I've done here is I've mounted the piece in the center on the screw chuck. You face off what will actually become the base, and you really do want this to be flat. Because you're going to be flipping this backwards and forwards, getting these faces true and parallel is important. So having got it flat, I then have two jaw sets, and you'll see this as I come through that I'm using large set and small set. So you start by marking out a mortise for the larger jaws. More accurately you can do this, the better. Now, unlike a normal mortise where you may cut everything out, you're not going to cut everything out. You're actually going to cut so that you can fit the jaws in, and you leave the center of the piece of wood in place. So the reason you leave that center in place is because you're going to be creating a tenon for the off-center turning at a later date. So, and given the size of the jaws, unless you go to sort of 130 mil jaws or something really beefy, with 100 mil and 50 mil, which is what I use for this, I sized it as accurately as I could to get as much, and then I test fitted the chuck so that I could make sure that it would actually seat into that mortise. So, you know, you've now got a mortise cut. At this point, you know, you just turn the bowl as you would turn the outside of the bowl as you would normally, right? You're running true. You've faced off the base. You've got your mortise cut. Turn the outside of the bowl, and get ready for the fun, as they say. So once you've done that, you rotate it and you mount the piece. And I mounted the piece in the mortise in expansion mode, using that mortise, using the largest set of jaws that I've got, or the large set of jaws that I was using in this particular instance. And now again, you face off what is actually the top of the bowl, and you want to make sure that is flat and runs parallel to what you had faced off before in terms of the base. Again, because you're turning this backwards and forwards, you want to get as accurate as possible, because otherwise your bowl will just be a little bit out of center. So once you've faced it off, you can add, if you so desire, you'll see the piece later, but there is space for sort of decoration here if you want to decorate, but the bowl in this instance is running as you would any normal bowl. It is running true. It is running concentric on the lathe. So if you wanted to put a rim or an inlay on the outside of the bowl, now's the time to do it. Once you do that, you can finish sand the broader face, and the reason you do this is it will become clear later, but this is where you finish the broader face of the bowl. So now you reverse the piece again back onto the worm screw. This time though, you're mounting using the offset hole. So you're not mounting on center, you're mounting on that offset hole, 10, 15 mil, whatever you've chosen. So this is why I say have the largest possible jaws that you can use, because you flatten the face off. Now as you wind the piece in, it will seat parallel so that you now have base and face of the piece running true. So what I do at this point is find the new center. So, and then I mark based on, again, as accurate sizing as I can for the 50 mil jaws, the smaller set of jaws. Hence, you know, the pencil marks that are there. So now you've got your mark of what you'll cut for a tenon. So as you turn the lathe on, this is the first time you get the piece spinning off center. So slower speed is necessary. If you so desired, sharpen your tools so they're freshly sharpened, because you're running at a slower speed. But at this point, you cut the tenon, for your 50 mil, for in this instance for the smaller jaws, the 50 mil jaws. And I try to aim to cut that tenon to the same depth as the mortise that I cut earlier. So initially you'll get a little bit of jumping because you've got a different depth in the wood, but eventually you'll get this true, and you'll end up with a piece that is tenon that's cut, and you've got the mortise that's still there. And this is what people refer to as the sun and moon. So now you've still got a piece. You can mount this true if you want using the mortise, and you can now mount it in the smaller chucks, in the smaller jaws, on that tenon that you just created in compression mode. So this is where you can get really creative, depending on the swing that you chose. That dictates the size of the bowl that's really possible. I do find it useful to mark the outline of what that off-center bowl will look like, because you really, once you've got this far, you really don't want to go off the edge. And if you have in the previous step finished that broader face, what you can see is you've got the wider rim and the narrower rim. If you want a flat piece, and you want to avoid what Alan was describing earlier of eventually cutting through air, which you can do, it's best to avoid cutting the face, because if you cut the face at this point, you are going to be turning air as that spins. Definitely possible, but as you sort of move up to trying this, start simple and then expand. This is where as well you would think about if you want to embellish the off-center rim. This is where again you could add a bead, you could add a groove, you could add inlay or whatever. So you would end up with multiple inlays to decorate the piece. But again, that's just that's personal choice. So once it's marked, again, you go back with to standard hollowing. It's running at about 500 to 600 RPM. I did freshly sharpen that gouge because of the slower speed that I was working at. But you just hollow as you would do normally, with one exception, which is as you are doing this, you want to make sure, that as you hollow this out, you do stop and you measure, because you are off center. You've got more wood one side than the other. So as you hollow out, you don't particularly want to go through the side. So you're not getting a even wall thickness. But if anything does go wrong, and I've seen people get catches on the face, you can go back and mount the piece on that mortise. So you can go back and true it up again if you absolutely have to. So one thing to note, just make sure you keep your hands behind the tool rest. You do not want to get your knuckles wrapped when that piece is spinning, because it is spinning off center and it will give you a nasty wrap. With this particular piece, I decided I wanted to challenge myself. So I decided to put a bead around that off-center bowl. It did mean I had to go back. I had to go back and reface this piece to make sure that the face was flat. But again, it's running off-center. You're turning at 500 to 600. Once you've turned it, you've got the depth right, sand and finish it as you would do a normal piece. Then your third chuck option.
Ed,
yes.
Before you go on, can you go back to the bead? I'm just trying to think through where you're on the off center.
I understand
how that works for the inner bowl.
So you're on the if I go, let's just see if I can get going. So you're off center.
Right.
You would hollow as you would do any normal bowl.
Right.
But if I go outside of that pencil line that you can see spinning there,
Yep.
I'm basically cutting that bead. And as I work out across the face, that's when you start cutting air as it's spinning. So you reface the piece in an off-center mode. So you've cut the bead, it's spinning off-center, and as you cut the narrow piece of that rim, you've got wood all the way around. As you get further out on the bottom part of that picture there, Alan, you're cutting air. So you have to be very, very careful, light cuts as you go out and reface it.
I see. So you're refacing but on the off-center axis.
On the off-center axis, correct.
Right. Okay. All right. I wanted to make sure I understood that. Thank you.
Yeah. No problem. It's a good question. And again, it's more pronounced because you can only run at a slower speed. As the gouge runs across that face, it really does mean light cuts, sharp gouge, light cuts, because you don't want to suddenly, the gouge to dive in as you sort of dip off the narrow edge and then come around for the thicker edge. So, I mean, it's not difficult, but it's just something you want to take a little bit of time over. And then, like any normal piece, you'd finish the base. The one, if anyone uses vacuum chucks or that approach to finish, you can't use vacuum chuck here because, of course, you're off center. So you have to use cold jaws or a jam chuck to finish the base. I've got both. You can see in the picture there, I've got both the dead center and the new off center marked from the live center that I was using. Some people like to leave this as a decoration on the bottom. It does, excuse me, it does require a little bit of hand sanding, but it is quite an attractive base to finish. But in this instance, I won't go bore you with that, but I basically turned it all away. I've left this piece. It's a fairly chunky piece, and it was green turned, so I do expect it to move. I've left that mortise there, so if I really want to remount it and try and retrue the face, I can. I'm more likely to actually cut stuff off the base to enable the piece to lay flat or sit flat on a surface once it's moved. So all done. That's what the piece looks like.
Yeah, it's a beautiful piece.
Very well done.
It's just something different. My wife actually hates these off-center bowls. Every time I ask her if she likes them, she says she doesn't because they're off-center. So she hates them. But you can see as well in the finished piece where the grain selection or the selection of where you put that off-center point. As you think about the design, all the spalting on this particular blank happened to be on the right-hand side, and I really wanted to accentuate that. But it
Beautiful.
gives you, thank you. I mean, it just gives you a different view and a different piece. For anyone that likes carving or stuff like that, you've got plenty of surface area on that thicker rim to carve as well and put any designs that you may want to put in there if you really want to. A couple of tips and tricks just to share with people. If you have two chucks, it makes life a lot easier because you're flipping this piece backwards and forwards. Having two chucks with the the jaws installed just saves a little bit of time, just makes life a little bit easier. I used the 50 mil and the 100 mil for this piece. I could have gone one size up in the chucks, but in the jaws, but this has worked out pretty well for me. It's not impossible to do it with one, but just have your Allen key ready, because you will be changing the jaws on a regular basis to get this done. As I mentioned, the base, you can't use a vacuum chuck, just will not work. So you have to have some mechanism, cold jaws or a jam chuck, to allow you to finish the base. Something that you can actually run, you can get the face flat. Donut chuck, Longworth chuck would also would work, but cold jaws are typically the way I do it. Just one other tip, actually not related to this: if someone does use cold jaws, it's often quite handy to mark the holes. I've got a series of red and green lines there on my cold jaws. It helps me just align the buttons when I know what size bowl I'm going to be putting in there. Just something that someone told me along the way. Very important to consider the grain direction, figure and/or defects. So if you, I in practice for this, I turned a couple of pieces of elm. Both were green. One I turned with the off axis at 90 degrees to the grain, and that piece has stayed almost perfectly true. The second piece that I turned, because of the way I wanted to turn it, I was at sort of 45 degrees to the grain. And that piece is warping. I mean, it's not bad, but it's warping a treat as it dries out. So, you know, how you select these pieces, it's just something to consider. And as I mentioned, the further, I mean, you can go a long way off center, but the further off center you go, the smaller that bowl will be. So just be prepared. How you actually finish the piece. So these are a couple that I've turned. The top two pieces are platters. Bottom two are bowls. The bottom ones are, the one on the left is elm. That's the one that's actually staying true, because the grain almost runs straight through that bowl. The other one is ash, and that one has stayed true as well. Just different types of design there with the bead, or just with a very simple line. The top left is a piece of maple, and it's very hard to see the off-center bowl in that, even though it's a platter. As I look back on that, I mean, I love the figure in the piece, and I really like the piece, but I sort of kicked myself because I didn't put some form of line or some delineation that actually shows that it is an off-center piece. So again, it's personal choice, but some form of embellishment just to highlight the piece, I think, is always a benefit. As you're turning that bowl off center, measure and check, measure and check, measure and check, because you have uneven wall thicknesses. You do want to be very, very careful. So I happen to have a set of Andre Martel gauges. They're a bit pricey, but they are fantastic gauges. And I would stop on a regular basis through that turning to just to make sure I'm not too close on the narrow side of the bowl. You do get some chunky pieces. I warn you, these pieces don't become feather light in the hand. So don't end up having an argument with your significant other, because this piece could do some damage if it were hurled at you. The other thing is, because they are chunky pieces, be prepared for some wobble. You will get some lathe wobble. Don't care how heavy your lathe is, you will get some wobble. Now, you can turn the speed up to get through the wobble, but you just have to do so cautiously. And as I mentioned, you do require a slightly slower speed when turning. That is, unless you want to dance with your lathe around the workshop, because you will get the lathe moving.
You don't turn it up to 3,000 like Jimmy Clues?
Yeah, I wasn't brave enough to do that, David. I have turned speed up, and you'd be surprised how much it does ease the wobble, but you just don't know what's inside some of these pieces sometimes. So you just got to be careful. And the fact that this was a green piece, it was a lot heavier on one side. So. And as I mentioned, just take the rotation into account on the swing of your lathe, because if you've got a 10-inch swing or 20-inch swing, you're not going to be able to turn a 10 or 20-inch bowl at least in an off-center mode. And the last thing I would say to people is, don't be afraid. First, I saw this a couple of years ago, and I tried it, and I was a little bit apprehensive when I started, but you actually can get some very interesting results. As I said, the bowls are chunky, they are heavy, but endless possibilities in terms of design and embellishment that you can put into these pieces. And if someone sees them, they sort of have to, they stop, and they take a double take, and they will ask you, how did you manage to do that? So if you want to start conversation with someone, just have one of these pieces out, because it really is a conversation starter. So, and that was it. So if anyone has any questions, shout, and I'll be happy to do my best to answer them.
That was great, Ed. Thank you.
Great demo.
It's really interesting. It's great.
Oh,
Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, fantastic. Ed, how many bowls do you think, or platters do you think you've made since you started this technique, roughly?
Off-center pieces?
Yeah. Yes, off-center.
Off-center pieces, probably somewhere between half a dozen and a dozen. I don't do them a lot, Ken. I mean, this is the piece that.
Oh, yes.
That we
Nice.
just talked about. It is, I've probably left about 3/4 of an inch on the base, because I know this is going, as this dries, it's going to warp, and I will take some off the base to lighten it up. But I mean, it's probably, this piece is 9.5 inches diameter, and it's 2 3/4 deep right now. It probably weighs just a little over a pound. So it's not a light piece, but as I say, Ken, probably about half a dozen to a dozen pieces, and at least face, bowls, platters. So I've still got a long way to go in terms of practice.
But at the same token, you've really mastered the technique, within just, making that quantity of bowls. That one you were just showing is a beautiful piece.
This one's definitely a keeper, but thank you. I appreciate the kind words. I mean, it's accuracy is what matters. If you get it right, if you get the base flat and faced off, and then you get the face flat and faced off, and you get those tenons cut, the mortise and the tenon cut at the same depth, so that you can mount the piece either way. It's just like turning another bowl. you're just doing it a bit slower.
Yeah.
And
Well-
aside from your wife, do you find your customers, do they like the offsets?
They do.
Offset? Yeah,
They do. Yeah, they do.
they've sold.
That's
them.
all right, because your wife wouldn't give you any money for it anyhow.
Well, that's right. You're quite right, Joe. She wouldn't. She'd probably throw it at my head if she got her hands on it.
And I have a question, and especially when it comes to platters where perhaps the bowl wouldn't be as deep. Have you ever had an issue with the actual depth of the worm screw and consider using like a washer to limit the amount you have to drill in, or was that never an issue?
Well, no, it is an issue, and that's a great question, actually. So on that point, so for the platters, Joe, I mean, the reason I use a worm screw is because I can use the faceplate, but the screw depth really does become an issue. So that's why I use a worm screw. When I turn platters, I actually have a couple of plywood spacers that I use that I put on the face of the chuck. They're dead flat. They go right over the worm. They actually turn onto the worm screw as well, so everything is buttoned up tight. And that then tailstock comes up because I don't have as much bite on the worm screw. And I do as little on the base with platters without the tailstock, if that makes sense. So only when the tailstock has to go away does it go away, because you really don't have the depth of bite. So it's a great question, Joe. So yes, I do use spacers.
Thank you. And the other question, and it goes back to what Alan said, and I think when you create that bead around the off center, you're absolutely right in that it really helps, define that. But in terms of the actual creating, or I guess now the only way you're creating that bead is by removing the wood around it. And I guess my question is, I'm assuming you're going in with the lower wing of that gouge and sort of scraping it and drawing it out. Is that the case? Or do you sometimes go from the out in, which case could be difficult because you have air?
Yeah.
How do you approach that?
So what I would do is I would turn the inside of the bowl as you would normally. It just happens to be off center.
Yes.
And then create the bead. So roll the gouge to create the bead.
Yes.
And then I use a shear. I drop the handle right the way down, and I use a very light shear cut.
Scrape. Oh.
To basically take the face down.
And then you draw it out as you.
I go from inside out. Yes, because of the off center rotation, and the fact that if I am not good enough to go outside in and not end up with some horrendous catch that would make me leave the workshop for the day, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, so I do a very fine shear scrape, roll the gouge round with the handle dropped as far down as I can get it. So it's a very, very light shear cut.
Wonderful. That's excellent. Right. Beautiful.
It's fun. It's fun to do.
Well, Ed, I really wanted to thank you for volunteering to do this main demo. And again, a whole new different concept. I don't recall us, seeing a technique like this before in some of our demos. So again, you brought, new techniques to the table here. And I just wanted to thank you for all your efforts in putting the presentation together.
Well, thanks. I mean, thank you for the opportunity, Ken. I mean, it was actually fun to do. I mean, I do like doing some of these different pieces. So, it was a good excuse to turn some off-center stuff.
Yeah.